let's break our attacks against wireless into two general categories for a moment before we actually get into some of the attacks. Let's talk about passive attacks. This is the fact that it is wireless, so the emanations go beyond our building, and people can listen to those emanations. Those electronic emanations can be picked up by anybody who turns their wireless access card into promiscuous mode. Today, what people do is they use laptops and they use external Wi-Fi cards with very large antennas hooked up to them, and they can suck up all of our data. So anything that is not encrypted is going to be flowing to somebody, and they assume that they know all of that activity. Wireless technologies of all kinds, Bluetooth and everything else, are susceptible to these emanations. Now that's different from an active attack. A passive attack says, I don't have to be on your property, I don't have to be invading you, I can listen to you all day long because you're shouting out in the forest so I can hear what you have to say. Active attacks, now what's happening is the adversary is reaching into our network and interacting with us, which in most jurisdictions, that's illegal. What you want to look up to find out about how the active attacks are working today and the tools that they're using for those active attacks is wirelessdefense.org. If you go there, what you'll see is they've listed off all the tools in a very large mind map that shows you, okay, if it's a wireless, if it's WPA or WPA2 or WEP or LEAP, if it's using these technologies, then what we want to do is we want to take these actions against those technologies, and eventually we will compromise the system. It's just a question of time for everything except for Radius and WPA2 with Radius incorporated into it. So the active attacks are well documented and well understood at this point. Let's talk about a couple of them. Denial of service. Here what we're doing is we're just blocking the signal so somebody else can't have access. The proper terminology for this in denial of service usually is called deauthorization, or just deauth. And in that case, what we do is we say we won't allow you to try and authenticate as a real client to a real network. We will stop you from doing that, and we can send just a few packets to stop you from doing that. So we could, when we just talk about generally about denial of service, it could be consumption of resources like wireless, or alteration of the resources or information. That's usually the deauth at that point. And physical destruction, I don't know that we actually destroy the access points if they're on the outside of anything. I think it's very easy to block them in most cases and then let people seek and destroy on these little tiny devices. We could do flooding, and we don't normally do that on wireless access points because the wireless access points aren't the large portion of the network. They're the smaller portion, they're the smaller pipe. We're talking about either 10 megabits or 54 megabits at its perfect best in most cases. Oh, by the way, in 802.11n, as in Nancy, they talk about, you'll see on the outside of the wireless access point, it'll say 108 megabits. You're never going to get 108 megabits of service. But let's go back down to 54 megabits, which is where we live today. If I was to do flooding against the network and I was to pump 54 megabits of request over that wireless access point to consume all the resources, what's on the other side of that wireless access point? What's the connection to the internet? Because the access point isn't a connection to the internet. It's just a router to get there. So what's the connection for that enterprise on the other side? Well, first off, it steps up to 100 megabit full duplex Ethernet, so there's no bottleneck on the switching side of this. But then when it gets to the router at the edge, what's the connection to the internet on the other side? Is it, a T1 of 1.5 megabits or a T3 of 45 megabits? Or do you have the latest Verizon Fios? Or do you have the latest Wi-Fi access, WireMax access? Or do you have Google Fiber in your home? By the way, Google Fiber is coming to Austin, and I can't wait. I'm going to move my house to wherever the Google Fiber is so that I can have that gigabit service to the internet. But most organizations don't have that gigabit service to the internet, so theoretically in flooding from wireless, on the wireless access point, if you could take over, you could send 54 megabits of request onto that wireless access point. That would go to 100 megabits of service and then to the edge of the network there to get out. and deny all the other requests that were going. As soon as somebody saw that happening in any kind of enterprise infrastructure, they would just kill the wireless access point in favor of the wired clients within the organization, or they would have tools to actually shun that particular host that's out there. Man-in-the-middle attacks are now we're talking about intercepting the signal from an individual host going to an access point, capturing all that information and utilizing it in some inappropriate way. That's basic man-in-the-middle attack. Hijacking takes the man-in-the-middle attack and it goes to the next level. It says, I, as a wireless client, have a valid connection to a wireless access point. That's all valid at this point. And what you do is you see my signal, you intercept that signal, and then you bump me out of the way. So you do a denial of service against the individual client while capturing their particular connection to that wireless access point. So hijacking is very real when it comes to wireless access, but what will happen is you'll get a lot of noise from that client that got kicked off, and they'll try and get back in. The thing about this person in the environment that's using that wireless access point, if they keep on getting kicked off the wireless, they'll go to complain to somebody on the inside, and then that will be the first intrusion detection system that kicks off. What about forensics for wireless? Like, what are we doing? Okay, let's look at the general steps here and then dig down into the details in just a minute. First, we're going to obtain a search warrant, if we need to, for a location that we don't control. We're going to figure out what the wireless devices are, both the access points and the clients and what they're using. We're going to look for rogue access points. Somebody set up some sort of signaling mechanism. And by the way, wirelessdefense.org talks about that very thing of creating rogue access points as one of the steps in the process of compromising an entire wireless organization. Document the scene and maintain the chain of custody on all of that evidence. Figure out what wireless connections are out there and figure out the field strength so that maybe we can tune our infrastructure so that the wireless access points support the internal of the building and not reaching out to the parking lot and allow somebody to surf there. So you can also map the wireless zones and hotspots to know what is a part of your organization, and that's usually what we're talking about is radio frequency shaping is usually the term for it. If you connect to that wireless access point, then you can, or that wireless network, then you can detect what the authentication and encryption mechanisms are. You'll collect up that information for your forensics to know it's important. Use Nmap, acquire the analysis data, acquire all the data and perform the analysis, dig into generating the report, and the forensics for wireless is kind of roll it all up at that one point. Now, when we talk about forensics, obtaining a search warrant, we know that if we're dealing with criminal activity, then it may be that we have to go to law enforcement and get them involved. Remember, you're not part of law enforcement. You don't play it on TV, so therefore you've got to go to somebody else and say, hey, this is the problem. Now what you're saying to them is, in our organization, we have wireless and we can't control it because somebody's stealing from us. And unless this is significant level of crime, it's unlikely that you're going to get a search warrant for somebody who's parked in your parking lot. But this has happened. And the perfect example of this is the TJX or TJ Maxx attack, where a criminal sat in the parking lot, picked up the wireless access points, and actually stole credit card information. This was also done with one of the larger do-it-yourself lumber yards that's out there. I don't know which one it was, but I know that the exact same thing happened to them, where the transmission of the terminal for credit card information was bundled up inside of the warehouse, and then it was sniffed on the outside, and they actually got all the credit cards by trapping the information that was flowing inside of the retail outlet. Then you're going to get a search warrant because this is something where they're actually stealing money. But if they're just stealing signal, it's highly unlikely that somebody's going to help you in that case. We want to figure out where the wireless device is. So if they've physically planted it there outside of your location, then you can say, hey, this is or is not on our property. We want to figure out where those wireless networks are. Maybe they're trying to intercept our signal or overwrite our signal. You're going to have to do a lot of manual work at that point. You're going to have to do some wireless war walking, as it were. There are plenty of tools out there like fluke meters that will tell you about your radio frequency, your footprint that you have, and others that are intruding on it. You can do active wireless scanning against your own network, but you can only do passive wireless scanning against other networks. So if somebody's intruding on your footprint of wireless, you can't reach into theirs. I like Nessus as a vulnerability scanner, but it's more geared toward the operating system and much less geared toward doing wireless penetration testing. Rogue access points. Somebody stands this thing up and they say, hi, instead of going to your corporate signal, go to me. And the name of my signal is the same as your corporate signal. So the end user's workstation gets confused and says, okay, I'll go over here. That rogue access point is then used as either a man-in-the-middle attack at that point, or to actually hijack the signal as it goes. To detect the rogue access points, you need something mobile to figure out where they are and verify whether that access point is rogue or not. That's rogue access points. We're going to dig into a couple more attacks in just a minute.